Private Members' Business, Order of the Day number 1, International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian People, resumption of debate on the motion moved by the member for Fowler.
Question is the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for CALWELL.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I rise today to speak in recognition of the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian People, and I want to thank the member for Fowler for bringing this motion to the House and for his important advocacy on this issue, but for his long-standing advocacy on all other human rights issues as well, and I thank him. This day, Deputy Speaker, of solidarity with the Palestinian people is important because it not only affirms the principles of justice and international law, but it also serves to hold a mirror to the world and to the institutions of the United Nations. It is a day which holds member states to account on progress towards their commitments to the inalienable rights of the Palestinians, including their right to self-determination and a future built on peace, dignity, justice and security. Deputy Speaker, earlier this year I noted that the international community must not absolve itself of the responsibility it has to ratify its own resolutions. This year alone, we've seen this reality tested and come out short on all the benchmarks of humanitarian and international law. Instead of implementing resolutions that form the basis of a future built on the principles we serve to uphold, we instead continue to see the Palestinians suffer the indignities and violence of occupation and conflict. I also said, Deputy Speaker, then that Australia has a long history of engagement in multilateral institutions as a middle power with a pragmatic problem-solving ethos that gives priority to our diplomatic engagements. What framework do countries such as ours have to speak of, if not the resolutions of the United Nations and the principles of international law? When it comes to the question of Palestine, and indeed to all our international obligations, we can't simply refer to charters and principles without any enforcement during times of deceptive calm, while doing away with them in their entirety during times of heated attacks. The irony is that doing so doesn't just absolve us of responsibility, it has the unintended consequences of denying us the ability to hold others to account in the international arena, not just on this question, Deputy Speaker, but on issues within our own regional sphere. And I emphasise this because we're not here today to memorialise. The member for Fowler's motion stands to affirm an issue that not only remains alive and impactful, but in fact has a major impact on a significant number of matters affecting our world today. Action means ending the crippling military occupation, the world's longest in modern history, and addressing matters that the United Nations identifies as critical, namely Jerusalem, refugees, borders, settlements, security and water. This day of solidarity reaffirms the saying that where there is no justice, there is no peace to be found and ultimately no security for all sides. It's not just solely an international issue, Deputy Speaker. Its context finds itself here, which, as this motion recognises, is very important to many across the Australian community, including in my own community. And today I want to reference Hisham, my constituent, who spoke to me about his late father, Hayel, who was also my constituent and a member of our local Palestinian community. And I want to quote Hisham. "My father was born in Safad, in the north of what was once Palestine. Very early on, he became a refugee, forced to live stateless. My grandmother carried my father and his brother in her arms to the point of exhaustion as they made their way across the border into neighbouring Lebanon, forced to split from my grandfather along the way. What was meant to be temporary refuge became permanent exile. All the while, Safad became inaccessible to him, my father. Jerusalem became inaccessible to him, my father. The waters and land of what was once home became foreign. And my father, like the hundreds of thousands of others who shared his fate, were forced to live as stateless refugees without peace and security and without a place to call home." Hisham goes on to say, and I quote, "That's how this tragedy continues, because everything stems from a lack of resolution brought about by a lack of resolve. At what point does the international community say, let's live up to our own values? At what point does the world recognise that charters, resolutions and laws are there to be actually implemented?" These words, Deputy Speaker, are poignant because with each aspect of the conflict that needs to be addressed, there remains an internationally recognised and agreed upon mechanism for which to refer to. And these are the resolutions of the United Nations itself. Today, Deputy Speaker, not only affirms our solidarity with the Palestinian people, it is a day which serves to reaffirm our commitment to international law.
I thank the member for CALWELL. The question is the motion be agreed to. I call the member for Parkes.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I speak today in support of the motion from the member of Fowler in solidarity with the people of Palestine. Mr Deputy Speaker, until a number of years ago, I was blissfully unaware of the intricacies of what was going on in that part of the world. I would see the news reports that were coming through about issues at Gaza and the West Bank and not really be taking much notice. But after spending 8 days on the West Bank, you cannot unsee what you see. And what I saw during those 8 days were a people who are under military rule, who are suppressed, who have no rights, and in some ways where it's espoused that they do have rights, they don't have rights. And the Palestinian Authority that has control over the major cities in the West Bank are really, the Israeli army can come and go as it pleases under whatever circumstances that they wish. Now, you know, the debate in this place sometimes becomes, are you for or against it? And if you're for Palestine, somehow you're supposed to be anti-Semitic. But I'd like to think, Mr Deputy Speaker, I've been around long enough so that people know that I'm not a radical on any event. But when I see an injustice, it needs to be called out. And I ask people, you know, how would you manage, you know, if you had a business that relied on water supply, like a brewery, but for days on end the water supply gets cut off because it's not under your control. The electricity supply can be cut off for days on end because it's not under your control. And you could go away for a weekend and come back and find someone has moved into your home, and when you call the police, they arrest you, not the people that are in your home. I saw that with my own eyes in Hebron, where the centre of the town had been overtaken illegally by settlers. I saw settlements and the image of maybe some temporary buildings on top of a hill in the West Bank does not describe the settlements. The 620,000 Israelis living illegally in the West Bank. And these are cities. These are cities with shopping centres and swimming pools and movie theatres and a substantial solid homes. These are permanent settlements. And the access to these settlements only built on roads that Israeli citizens can use and not Palestinians. How would you like to live in a land where your access is cut off not only by roads that you're allowed to use, but at times of the year where military activities mean certain parts of your country are no-go zones? How would you like to be a farmer and to know that all the lowlands in the Jericho Valley, the highly productive lands, have been taken from your control, and you've to eke out a living on a bare, bony ridge? The policy of the Australian people and our government is looking to a two-state solution. Mr Deputy Speaker, I think we're beyond that. I think we have a level of apartheid with a suppressed people, and the West Bank has been cut up to such an extent, I don't know how that would work. And I think, as the member for CALWELL says, I think it's going to require a lot of effort from the world to actually come up with a solution that's relevant to now. One of the most tragic things I saw was interviewing university students in Bethlehem, and realistically the limit of their future was very bleak. And as the member for CALWELL did, I'd like to recognise one of my constituents, actually the Mayor of Canberra in Western New South Wales, Al Caranow. Al's family were from Jaffa, and in 1948 were moved out, and initially to Lebanon, and then from the four corners of the globe. He has relatives living all over the globe. There's still one of his family members that carries the key to the house in Jaffa around their neck as a permanent reminder of what they've lost. Al turned up in Canberra with basically the clothes on his back, built a successful business and became the mayor, and is driving that community with the same passion as Palestinians are all over the globe. Mr Deputy Speaker, I support the Palestinian people. The globe needs to act. World leaders need to
I
act.
thank the member for Parkes. Question is the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Canberra.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise today to speak on the motion moved by the member for Fowler, and I'd like to acknowledge his ongoing advocacy for the Palestinian people. The motion, of course, is in recognition of the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people on the 29th of November. Deputy Speaker, Israel has a right to exist, and Israelis should be afforded the right to live in peace without any fear of attack from either beyond their borders or within. But Palestinians should also have these same rights to live in peace. The establishment of Israel resulted in more than 700,000 Palestinians being forcibly removed from their homes and lands to become internally displaced or refugees in neighbouring countries. In 1967, 300,000 more Palestinians became refugees, some for the second time. To this day, they and their families live under the UN Refugee Charter and resolutions and have the right to return to their homes. Many of these refugees are in the West Bank and Gaza, are stateless in neighbouring countries, or are spread throughout the world. Palestinians make up 21% of the global refugee population. In the West Bank, Palestinian families and communities have lived under Israeli military occupation for over 50 years. All aspects of their lives are controlled by Israel. Movement is restricted, building permits denied, access to land and water and trade with other countries severely limited. People living in the West Bank should have the right to live in their own homes without a looming threat of being forcibly removed. Gazans should have the right to live without the fear that a bomb will level the building they occupy, and that they should not be subject to a blockade that should be allowed to come and go from the strip whenever they like. Palestinians should have the right to live in a state of their own. Deputy Speaker, too often these rights are violated. The violence we saw earlier this year claimed the lives of over 200 Palestinians, including at least 65 children. The world watched as the fighting unfolded, and what we saw was absolutely unthinkable. We also saw the lives of 12 Israelis, including 2 children, lost, and this must also be condemned in the strongest of terms. We saw the bombing of a building housing the very little media that exists in the Strip, crippling the world's access to on-the-ground reporting. We saw the anger of an oppressed people, the heartbreak of children who had lost their parents and of parents who had lost their children. Today, Palestinians are in a terrifying position. Under the Oslo Agreements of 1993, Israel is in control of almost all of the water resources of the region. 80% of the water goes to Israel, only 20% to Palestinians. Palestine is forced to buy back this water, of which up to a third is lost to leakage. As a result, the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza have water consumption levels far below the World Health Organization recommended level. And this is what happens when a group of people aren't afforded the basic human right of self-determination. One example of the oppression faced by Palestinians is the story of jailed World Vision Gaza program manager Mohammed El Halabi. In 2016, Mr El Halabi was arrested while crossing the border between Israel and Gaza. He was accused of redirecting more than $50 million in aid money to Hamas and other militant groups, was interrogated for 50 days and has spent the past 5 years in jail. That is despite investigations by the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs, independent auditors and World Vision finding no evidence of wrongdoing. In fact, World Vision says its entire Gaza budget during the time frame was being half the alleged money that was taken. Mr El Halabi still has not faced trial. His legal defence has been restricted and he has attended more than 150 court appearances. No substantial evidence to support the allegations against him have been produced in this time. Mr El Halabi is so respected that in 2014 he was named a humanitarian hero by the United Nations. He was offered a plea deal but has refused, maintaining his innocence, and so he continues to languish behind bars. And how has Australia reacted to this and many other injustices? Tim Costello, former CEO of World Vision Australia, says the Australian government has responded by cutting our aid through the World Bank to Palestine, halving our commitment through UN bodies, and has just axed an NGO partnership program supporting farmers throughout Palestine. Further, he says that Australia's silence makes us complicit. It falls like countries to Australia to engage with a process that will peacefully create a Palestinian state while ensuring the security for a Jewish homeland. I call on the government to ensure that Australia is using our voice to constructively support peace and security.
The motion be agreed to, and I call the member for FLYNN.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'd like to support the member for Fowler and the previous speakers, which I incur. They're all spot on, and anyone who's been to that part of the world, Palestine and Israel, knows exactly what they're talking about. The 29th of November is the UN Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. You know, we shouldn't have this day. They should have equal rights. And that's nothing asking too much. I've never met a Palestinian who doesn't want to be on equal terms. The days of conflict between Israel and Palestine have disappeared, and now all we're seeking is peace in that land. They should have their basic rights returned to them. They haven't got any rights, or very little rights at the moment. Their rights to safety and self-determination is not existing. And to live under apartheid rule, I've seen that firsthand. We're at a mosque in Hebron, and there was a line going into the mosque, Israelis on one side of the line and Palestinians on the other side. If that's not apartheid, I'd like to know what apartheid is. All they seek is fairness and equality and democratic rights for all parties who live in that one stretch of land. When I went to Palestine, I've seen this firsthand, the injustices to the Palestinian people on a day-to-day basis. It was evident everywhere I went, and anyone who ever goes to Palestine will know this. A guy once said to me, a Palestinian said, Ken, you might think you might know a little bit about our problems over here, but he said, until you live it day to day, you do not know or do not understand. You're only getting a slight insight into what's going on. Take the Jordan River, it's running dry. The Dead Sea, it's a good name for it actually, because it's getting deader and deader. As the Palestinians lose water out of the Jordan River to Israeli farmers, the salt content in that Dead Sea is increasing, and the level of the Dead Sea is dropping. There once was resorts around the top of the Dead Sea where you had water views. Now the water views are some 200 metres away from those resorts. That's how much the Dead Sea is shrinking. Water is a big issue for the Palestinians. They don't know when they got it, from one day to the next. And those black tanks on top of the roofs, you can always tell a Palestinian house when they've got black tanks, because they are Palestinian tanks, and they are only allowed to pump water into those tanks on a certain day of the week or the month, depending how much the Israelis want to give them. So these are the real things about what happens in Palestine. I call for to the end of Israeli occupation of Palestine territories. It's called a theft of the land. And as the member for Park said, you can be in your house one day, next day you get told you're leaving. Please remove yourself from the house, because tomorrow the bulldozers will come in and it's gone. Where do you go? Who knows? There's Israelis coming back from all parts of the world, and they need houses. This is the issue. This is why you get the new settlements controlled by the Israelis at the expense of the Palestinians. They keep on expanding. The West Bank was for Palestinians under the 1948 agreement. Now it's a hodgepodge of Palestinians and Israelis living in walled cities, big high concrete walls that have been erected around these new territories, that if a Palestinian happens to be working in a location inside those walls, he now has to get permission to go inside that wall to work, where his families have worked for hundreds of years. There's still people refugees in camps since 1948. These people have got no future. Gaza Strip, that should be abolished and let the people free to move outside those borders. I went to a university in Palestine, in Hebron, and they said the numbers are down because the Gaza people cannot move out of Gaza, come back into their universities. So it's a crying shame what's happening over there, and we should do everything as Australia and everything with the United Nations to get rid of these inaccuracies that are affecting people.
I thank the member for Flynn. The question is a motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Scullin.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. For the last 18 months, our world has seemed much smaller. The pandemic and its restrictions on movement has meant our focus has been close to home. And so it's been very easy to overlook events and issues beyond our borders. Too easy. But with November 29 fast approaching, I thank my friend, the member for Fowler, for putting forward this motion, which acknowledges the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian People and their inalienable rights. I acknowledge also the previous speakers in the debate, the member for Flynn who spoke so movingly about his lived experience and his concerns, the member for Parkes who made a very powerful contribution that I found very affecting, as well as those of my colleagues, the member for Canberra and my neighbour and friend, the member for CALWELL, who has been such a long-standing advocate for justice in this space. That we are having this debate matters to me. That we are demonstrating this sense of solidarity matters to me, and it matters to the people I represent in this place, Palestinian Australians and many others in Melbourne's northern suburbs from a very diverse range of backgrounds who want to see peace, justice and an enduring two-state solution, who too often despair at the lack of progress towards this and the terrible human cost that has been borne through these long-standing failures. Costs felt here in Australia as well as much more obviously in Palestine. One of the reasons I was so keen to speak to this motion was to acknowledge the force of contributions made to me by constituents earlier this year when I was able to hold street corner meetings and street stalls in May, when terrible images filled our TV screens, attesting to the deaths of 200 Palestinians and 12 Israelis. All these deaths which we mourn. People who urged me then not to look away, people who sought reassurance that Australia would take on a constructive leadership role, to stand up for human rights wherever they are threatened and to stand up for international law. Labor has, of course, long supported an enduring and just two-state solution to this conflict, reflecting the aspirations of the Palestinian people to live in peace and security within their own state, and the right of Israel to live in peace within secure borders internationally recognised and agreed between the parties. I'm proud that Labor's platform supports the recognition and right of Israel and Palestine to exist as two states with secure, recognised borders, and in government to progress towards self-determination and recognition. This is as it should be. The member for Fowler set out in his contribution very articulately concerns that I share for human rights, including access to the basic necessities of life, and in relation to the many obstacles which have stood in the way of the peace process, including settlement building and the blockade. And of course, the desperate and irresponsible politicking by the Morrison government around the unilateral recognition of West Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, putting Australia out of step with the international community and at risk of undermining the prospect of a durable solution. It's easy to look away from so far away as we are, but we can't, because everyone deserves the prospect of a future built on peace, dignity, justice and security. And that this today, as we stand here, seems so remote for the Palestinian people doesn't mean it can be ignored. We all need to work harder to support an enduring solution, to put in place whatever tangible steps we can to advance a peaceful future for the people of Palestine and the people of Israel. In doing so, to call out any actions by any party which undermine the journey to such peace. To speak up in this place, in our communities and internationally in support of human rights and in accordance with international law. To recognise, as the member for CALWELL did, that Australia has a proud record as a middle power for being an effective presence in support of a world governed in accordance with law, not in accordance with the dictates of power. That's a call that should be recognised. Deputy Speaker, as we lead up to November 29th, I want to put on the record my solidarity, my hopes and my determination to do what I can in this place to stand up for those enduring values of human rights and to see those rights and a peaceful future extended to all of those in need of it.
I thank the member for Scullin and call the member for BOWMAN. You're on mute, Andrew.
This motion have acknowledged this piecemeal approach that we've seen now not just for years but decades, and the economic and security challenges in the occupied Palestinian territories really look like being perpetuated, particularly recent events. And I just want to summarise the work of the relevant UN report, but also to make fairly obvious that many of us have already travelled to this part of the world, and we deeply thank our hosts for making that possible. But we all have to be very cautious that we don't develop a political view on this complex part of the world based on whoever funded our last delegation to the region, and acknowledge that unravelling this is highly complicated. It goes back well over 70 years. But the point that I wanted to make pretty clearly is that, short-term fixes aren't going to be the answer. Picking out isolated anecdotes and fixating on them as representing some form of, horrific injustice is not going to help fix the problem. And that additional crises led by COVID and the respective parties failing to work together and not focusing on the economic elements of this tragedy, which are the means to which we can one day have a political solution. But if we keep putting the politics of all of this first at the expense of economic opportunity, that's where we see the suffering. And the UNSCO is right to point out the economic and fiscal situation this month as being dire. And their report says we've got to take this head on. Every hour of every day that I was in that country, I was reminded of a famous quote, which is, stay for a day in Palestine, you can write a novel. Stay for a year and you can barely fill a page. And the reality is that the longer you stay there, the more you appreciate the complexity. We've had years of economic stagnation in the West Bank, and that's been seen further collapse during COVID. And obviously the situation at Gaza Strip is a multi-decade decline and not something that can be turned around overnight, particularly due to high unemployment and the status of women in that country. So it's increasingly difficult for the Palestinian Authority to either deliver on its mandate, let alone cover its minimum expenditures or make any form of critical investment in the economy. And that's what is our clear and present challenge right now, not to devalue, diminish or ignore the political challenges. But both parties are responsible for the economic elements, not just of water supply, not just of the work of the PA, but to make sure that we are constantly focused on vocational training and getting more graduates and addressing unemployment and having small micro opportunities become possible in the Palestinian run areas. And long-standing shortage of public funds is a concern, but we can't continue to expect international community 70 years on to be primarily responsible for this when neighbouring Islamic economies need to be playing not just an increased role, but almost the complete role in supporting the Palestinian territories, both in finding a diplomatic solution, but driving the economic possibilities for this generation right now. There's no need for the international community to be running schools and childcare centres. It's patronising. And the Palestinian Authority, despite its lack of funds, needs to be making sure that this is done with international bilateral partnerships where local countries with a stake in the reality on the ground are pulling their weight and not relying on this becoming a persistent global effort. It does not need to be that. Now, Israel as well, can do far more, releasing these clearance revenues, which they're unilaterally equating as, the amount paid by Palestinians to its prisoners and their families, or the families of those that are killed or injured during attacks. This is a severe crisis, and we don't want unilateral action either, and we need to be working on an integrated response. And I think calling for that this year and this month in a report, and it went on, obviously, we've now had released the last couple of days a chair's summary of the meeting, the ad hoc liaison committee that met in Oslo, when that was the 17th of November, and it was virtually supported. But all met at that high level, and they're trying to promote some form of cooperation between the parties, but with an economic focus. We're identifying the next step is an IMF report, because the destabilisation we're seeing at the moment, and the high friction that's been created in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, breakdowns and ceasefires, all of that are ultimately spawned from a political obsession in the absence of any economic development. And both parties need to be focusing on that, or having a second track that explicitly looks at economic development of the community, overcoming structural constraints for sustainable development of these Palestinian territories. Against that backdrop, I'm calling for both parties to continue that renewed focus and support the next step as we try and get economic development in the Palestinian state.
I thank the member for Bowman. The time allotted for this debate has expired. The debate is adjourned and a resumption of debate be made on all day for the next day of sitting.